When I was a child, my wonderful parents bought me an encyclopedia, which I still have. This listed the progress of humanity from the village state through the tribal state to the nation state, and listed world state yet to be achieved. No mention was made of the League of Nations or the United Nations, I suspect advisedly. When one sees such as the Scottish nationalists, all their leaders want is to be able to strut along what have rightly been called the corridors of power, shoulder to shoulder with Putin. Thus we are left in a limbo between nationalism and democracy, as set out in my book Democracy, Theory and Practice. Let me set out the problem in a series of anecdotes. The President of Brazil is appointed by the people of Brazil to act in the best interests of the people of Brazil, by carbon credits, for instance. This is leading to the depletion of the Amazonian rainforest, an asset belonging in democracy to the people of the world, as appears below, both present and future generations, which is most important. Nor does the answer lie in law. International copyright conventions exist which prevent copyrights existing indefinitely. In the 1930s, the copyright of the tune Happy Birthday to You was claimed by a school mom in a quiet Midwestern town in the USA. The courts of law of that state, was it Kansas, quietly extended the copyright beyond the normal 50-year period for purely nationalistic reasons, and courts of other states would not challenge this for the protection of their own power. This meant that for nearly a century that song was never heard in stage plays, cinema films, or on television until the copyright was recently successfully challenged on the basis that it had been previously published. But this was only as a result of meticulous research. It is established in common law and elsewhere that if someone loses a gold watch, for example, there comes a time when he is deemed to have abandoned it, so that the person finding it can claim property rights in it. Thus, when the captain of a ship orders abandoned ship, he is surrendering property rights in it. However, courts of the USA have, for instance, been trying to claim that this is not so, and the erstwhile owner of the ship can subsequently claim ownership. Nor does the answer lie in world government. It is only with the greatest difficulty that tyrannies are removed purely by internal means. Idi Amin in Uganda, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Hitler all had to be removed by external invasions, and a lot of gratitude we get for it. It is not generally recognised that Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, was not in fact head of state but head of government. This meant that when things began to go wrong for Italy in the war, he was able to be and was removed from office by purely constitutional means. Unlike Hitler, who, on the death of Hindenburg as president, took the precaution of declaring himself head of state. Thus the war against Hitler had to go on till his supposed death in... It is to be noted that Mussolini, Hitler and Stalin all derived from socialist beginnings. Socialism is not, as it is propounded by its adherents, the personification of peace and humanity, but the creature of majority rule. Their only desire is to get 51% of the vote and use it to steal money by taxation from the other 49%. Majority rule is the worst form of dictatorship with the greatest number of dictators. Majority rule is a conspiracy against the young. Capitalists wish to exploit them, and socialists wish not to protect them, but to get what they see as their fair share of the proceeds. With the aid of the supposedly independent and impartial BBC broadcasting, HM government is engaged in a sustained and determined campaign to con young people into taking up careers in engineering and technology and allied fields such as teaching against their better interest. In particular, it stigmatizes and disparages careers such as hairdressing, which they could take around the world with them and give them an income independent of capitalism and socialism. The greatest good of the greatest number is not democracy, but the reductio ad absurdum of the argument that democracy means majority rule. As I have shown previously, democracy means not majority rule, but the common good of all. Beyond the concept of Americans in particular, the difference between a head of state and a head of government is no mere semantic one. The Second World War in the Pacific came about as a trade war between Japan and the USA. If the current trade war declared by President Trump should become a hot one, America and the rest of the world may once again regret combining the two roles in the same person. As happened recently in Australia, where the Prime Minister lost a seat in the Parliament at a by-election, making him a minority leader. He requested the head of state in the person of the Governor-General to call a general election, fully expecting to win it. The latter quite correctly refused, and a new head of state government from the opposition party was able to govern successfully until the end of the parliamentary term. He was then able to win the general election himself. The one advantage of nation states is the fact that, in theory at least, if one is unhappy with the nation in which one is currently living, one is free to move to any other nation of one's choice. This is the common law democratic freedom of movement, which has for centuries been under attack, and rightly so, because of overpopulation. Democracy was unable to save the life of William Joyce, Lord Haw Haw, who was executed for treason. Examples of the common good of all are blackout regulations in wartime, where a single light could indicate an urban area, and regulations against infections such as COVID, where backbench MPs were perfectly happy to force the population back to work prematurely just to maintain the MP's dividends. This is a crime against democracy. A world government would be the biggest disaster in the human race, and from which there would be no escape except by the help of little green men from Mars. A world state, however, would have no such problems. The function of states is to make international alliances and to declare war on each other. The first advantage, albeit semantic, of the world state would be that it would be impossible for local states de jure to declare war on each other, as only heads of state can declare war. World state has been tried before. In early modern times, the Pope of Rome was, as guardian of the consciences of princes, divided up the world between Spain and Portugal, along the longitude of 40 degrees west, thus successfully preventing war between them. Thus Brazil now speaks Portuguese and Mexico, for an instance, Spanish. At the start of the second millennium, an article in the Times newspaper reflecting my own view was that just as then, 1,000 years earlier, Islam, with its typically 8 children per family, had been knocking on the doors of Europe. As I have said previously, this meant that the Serbs and thus Europe have had to surrender part of their territory to the Kosovo Muslims. It would be a great optimist who would claim that the future of the world could be determined by any particular religious philosophy. The founding of the world state is a purely metaphysical act, like making an appointment under a power of trust. It is determined purely by the head of state, in the head of the person doing it. I did this sometime in 1980, I forget the exact date. Until such time as it can establish its own hegemony in the form of courts of law and penal institutions, the world state can act only like the mafia by issuing contracts and like the ayatollahs by issuing fatwas. In the meantime, anybody's idea of what constitutes crimes against democracy as being contrary to the common good of all and in accordance with the said treatise is as good as everybody else's. The global village elders, being all those over a certain age, can form an upper house to ensure that the world state does in fact act for the common good of all. It may well be that nobody is willing to take on the role of local head of state of Brazil, for example, which is wholly to the good. Direct democracy can then take place, and the world state can move in to protect the rainforest against the people of Brazil and anywhere else for that matter. Logging companies are no respecters of national boundaries. Nations and nationalism are the greatest dangers. They exist purely to serve their populations. A head of state exists primarily to lead his army into battle and to be the first to be killed in doing so, like King Harold and Richard III. The populations of countries are not common cannon fodder to to protect the head of state. The function of the head of state is to protect the people of the country. The Vikings were like the biblical plague of locusts. If someone had said to a Viking, "Take me to your leader," he would have been told, "We have no leaders." With the rise of nationalism in the Middle Ages, the French objected to the use of longbows at Crécy-Agincourt on the ground that they killed officers and men indiscriminately. Common soldiers were supposed to kill each other and leave the officers to be ransomed. Henry V said, "I'll not be ransomed." In the American Rebellion of 1776, the officers were rightly ordered their men to shoot at the government officers, and not in the First World War. Zeppelin airships were not allowed to bomb west of Tower Bridge in case they came anywhere within range of bombing Buckingham Palace. So far from leading his army into battle, because he feared for the quality of the House of Lords, the King of the day ordered the sons of aristocrats not to join the frontline troops, but to stay safely behind the lines. In the Second World War, Tokyo was laid waste by conventional bombing, while the Imperial compound, the start of the trouble, was untouched. If ever a nuclear bomb was required, it was there. In support of the view that the USA, despite its majority rule, is not a democracy but a fascist behaviourist state, is the fact that after the war, Emperor Hirohito was allowed to stay on as head of state of Japan, though stripped of his divinity, despite the manifold war crimes committed in his name. This was on the basis that he had been kept in total ignorance of the war by his government. This is in spite of the fact that at the moment of surrender, a Japanese submarine was lying off the west coast of the USA, ready to shell San Diego with anthrax, in an operation personally sanctioned by the Emperor. Clerical services for the plantations of the West Indies were provided by indentured servants from India who sold themselves into slavery for a fixed term in return for a capital sum. The answer to this is not socialism. This is simple economics. Human life is so cheap because there is so much of it. By its one-child per family policy, China has reduced its population to below that of India. This is for the common good of all, and is thus the epitome of democracy in action. A significant role for the world state is in recognizing and rewarding those who have shown conspicuous gallantry both in defending democracy and in advancing its cause. The first recipients of this must be the Angry Brigade, not so much for advancing democracy, because at that time, the 60s and 70s, democracy was still wrongly thought to be majority rule, but by seeking to defend it against those such as capitalists whether private state or state socialists who seek to attack it. Capitalism is blackmail. An engineer can't build a bridge or an aircraft, for instance, unless he firstly sells his time as a wage slave to a capitalist, whether private or state. Paying pocket money to a slave to arrange his own board and lodging does not make him any less a slave. The important thing is to prevent young people from becoming slaves before it's too late to do anything about it. Don't invest where you don't own, as the Wilfrid Hyde White character tells us in that excellent cinema film Northwest Frontier. The first part of that recognition is the according the title of Heroes of Democracy. The Waco Massacre was an attack on democracy. Thus, the blowing up of the ATF building in Oklahoma City was not, as it is portrayed by the US government, an act of terrorism, but makes Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who were subsequently imprisoned or executed, heroes of democracy. It is the Waco Massacre that was the act of state terrorism, and the Oklahoma bombing was the lawful execution of sentence. The US government tries to denigrate Waco as survivalists and play down the massacre as a mere siege, and to portray them as anti-government extremists. Julius Caesar had the solution at Alesia: build a fence around the compound and starve them out. The government is more concerned with the cost of the damage with the lives than with the lives lost at Waco, for which nobody has even been convicted or even tried. So far from terrorism, the Oklahoma bombing was an act of law enforcement. This is the epitome of what is meant by an act of world state. Incidentally, Dice's view of international law as the Committee of Nations, is much to be preferred to any view of double renvoi, which is the reductio ad absurdum of the contrary view. Private international law is a contradiction in terms. Lest it be thought that attacks on democracy are some new phenomenon, there have been attacks on democracy long before anybody knew what democracy actually meant. In 1549, Robert Kett led a rebellion against the Enclosure Acts of Henry VIII, which forced the peasants off the land, resulting in mass starvation and leading directly to the modern undemocratic system of land ownership we have today. The failure of the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 and the consequent Highland clearances led to the overpopulating of the British Empire by displaced Scots. Having led their clansmen, which means children, to defeat at Culloden, it is the clan chiefs that should have been displaced, doomed to roam the world like Pirandello's characters in search of an author. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819 in Manchester was a direct result of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, which would otherwise have led, if not to democracy, then to parliamentary reform, while having nothing directly to do with democracy, this would have prevented the immediate problem of very few people actually having the vote. The sole function of a democratic government is to protect the privacy of the inhabitants of its territory, both individually and collectively. Collectively against invasion from abroad, and individually by preventing them from being murdered in their beds. To do this, it should collect land tax from the landholders for distribution to all the inhabitants of that territory. As in the UK, proposals are before the wholly secret state organisation called the Investigatory Powers Tribunal to allow HM government to bypass encryption in electronic data storage, e.g. in cloud services and transmission, such as by client-side scanning. This means that no one may go online without being hacked. Would Hitler and Stalin say they supported democracy? Both came to power by majority rule. Those who ignore the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. I'll deal with that below.